it's Wyndham. Welcome back to the channel. I have a question for you today. How many of your emotions can you identify? You may be aware of a book by Brené Brown, The Atlas of the Heart, where she looks at our emotions and our emotional intelligence. And she found that the mean number of emotions her cohort, her group of interviewees could identify was 3. And in a really high, kind of basic level. They could identify when they were mad, they could identify when they were sad, and they could identify when they were glad. 3. Now, if you go back a little bit further, there's a US psychologist called Paul Ekman, and in the 70s, he put forward a theory that there are 6 basic human emotions: sadness, happiness, fear, anger, disgust, and surprise. So even from a very basic 1970s theory, most people can only identify 50% of 6 basic human emotions. In Brené Brown's work, she goes on to identify 87 distinct emotions that she broadly pulls into 13 different sort of land masses, she calls them. How many can you identify? Are you closer? I'm almost going to guarantee you are closer to the 3: mad, glad, and sad. Maybe you're a little bit more emotionally attuned, and you can identify and define the 6 that Paul Ekman talks about. But this isn't really about how many emotions we can identify. What I'm really interested in is why we can't identify them and what the impact of that is. What are our emotions? And why is it so important that we can identify with them, that we can connect with them? Because I'm 48 and I was not brought up to understand my emotions. It was not part of my education as a child. And that's no criticism on my parents. My parents are of an age where, when they were being brought up, their parents were the tail end of the Victorian era in the UK. Their parents had incredibly strict upbringings. And what we typically find generationally is a generation of parents make distinct strides away from the upbringing they were subject to. They've identified some of the elements of their upbringing that they do not want to repeat with their own children. However, there is a vast amount that goes on in bringing human beings up. And while they can identify certain elements that they do not want to perpetuate, there are others that they're just completely ill-equipped to change. And this emotional understanding is a massive one. I had a conversation with someone recently, and we were talking about our respective childhoods, and we were never taught about our emotions. In fact, all we were taught about was that they're inconvenient, that you suppress them, that you don't want to make a scene. We were taught, albeit inadvertently, to be embarrassed as an emotion by our emotions. We were taught that our emotions were bad in some way. We were only ever, even remotely, allowed to explore positive, what we would call positive emotions. Any negative emotions, well, we just need to push those aside. And we can see that played out and perpetuated in our society today. There is a vast amount of, I was about to be very uncomplimentary, of oversimplification in what we hear about our emotions. When we hear these things like positive mental attitude only, or positive vibes only, or when we hear people say, "Oh, cheer up, it might never happen," we're dismissing this whole part of our emotional repertoire. We're dismissing one of the most fundamental things about us as human beings. So what are our emotions? You know, I talk to lots of clients who they have this approach, this attitude to them almost that they're an inconvenience, or more frequently, they've just been shut off. For years, they and I did the same, disconnected from our emotions. They were an inconvenience. So we didn't feel them, we didn't learn about them, we didn't process them, we didn't know what to do with them. So we didn't do anything, we pushed them aside. But fundamentally, our emotions are not good or bad. They're not. We might identify the feelings they conjure within us on that very simple binary scale, but it's just a binary scale. What our emotions are simply messages. And every one of them is trying to teach us something, is trying to tell us something. And the reason we have such a problem with it is because it is a language we have not been taught. If you think of all of the languages of the world, you go to a different place, the timbre of the language, the pace of the language, the excuse me, the shape of the words, the volume people speak in, the intonation at the beginning, the end, it goes up or it goes down. All of these things are different language to language. Of course, there are similarities, but there are sufficient differences between certain languages that when we hear a language we have not been taught to understand, it can be alarming. Some languages are very powerful, very vocal. Other languages are very calm and lilting and move in a way that doesn't feel threatening. But where does that threatening come from? Well, it just comes from our own language, our own understanding. And we fill in the blanks, we fill in the gaps because we don't understand, and we don't fill in what they're saying, we create the intention of what they're saying. So when we come to our emotions, if we view it as a language we simply don't understand, we're doing the same thing. An emotion arises in us, feels all squirrely and uncomfortable, and maybe it's about to make us cry, or we feel that burning embarrassment. We have been taught to be embarrassed by those things. We do not live in a world where it's okay to cry in the street. We just don't, right? So we suppress those emotions, those messages. And because we suppress them, eventually we kind of push them far enough down that the immediate impact of them, how they make us blush or they make us want to cry or that sick feeling we might get, we push that aside and it stops. We interrupt that message. And because we interrupt it, it goes away. We kind of, okay, well, I'll just carry on. But effectively all we've done is ignore a message. We have interrupted our body and our mind and our soul and our heart's natural communication style. And because we've interrupted it, we don't learn from it. So we find ourselves in these situations again. We go round and round and round and round. And every now and then that emotion bubbles up because, as well as a communication system, I think of our emotions as it's simply energy. We are beings of energy. And if you know anything about the second law of thermodynamics, you will understand that it is impossible to create or destroy energy. It just gets transformed from one state into another. So when we can think of our emotions as an upswelling of energy in a particular state. And that is the message, the lesson it is trying to teach us. The only way we transform that message, that energy, from however it is making us feel into another state is by feeling it. The act of feeling our emotions is the process by which we transform it from one state into another. I spent hideous amounts of time, 30 plus, nearly 40 years deeply suppressing my emotions. Deeply, deeply, deeply. And I can equate to the mad, glad, sad. I was incredibly angry at times. I was very unhappy. And there were periods where I was like, oh yeah, no, I'm pretty happy at the moment. Yeah, that's great. But it was fleeting. If we are working on the basis of those three emotions, mad, glad, and sad, let's take the arbitrary, maybe not arbitrary, but the binary definition of good and bad. We've got two that fall into the negative, into the bad. Who wants to be sad and mad? We've only got one that fits into the, oh yeah, no, cool. You can experience that emotion. It's okay to be happy. It's okay to have gratitude. As a society, we're all right with that. We want people walking around with inane smiles painted on their faces. But it's only a third of the very basic emotions. When we suppress our emotions, that energy remains locked inside and it doesn't ever stay the same. It's almost like a fermenting process. If you bottle up natural fruit juice, over time it ferments. And as it builds, the carbon dioxide in that fermentation process increases the pressure within whatever receptacle, bottle, jar, whatever it is you've put it in. Eventually, if that fermentation is strong enough, it will blow the top off that bottle or jar. It will. That's just, the pressure builds to such a point that the thin screw head that's keeping it on can't cope. And that is exactly the experience I had. I had 3 massive emotional breakdowns over 20 years. And I'm not talking about the kind of emotional breakdown that sees you in bed for days on end. But there were 3 distinct moments where, seemingly out of nowhere, I broke down. And it was the kind of breakdown, thankfully I was with my wife, I think on all 3 of them. Thankfully, I was with her, because they're the kind of breakdown that you cannot stop. Can't interrupt it. It's going to run its course. You cannot speak while it's happening. You're incapable of coherent communication. But because it's just an outburst, it doesn't address the core problem. And the core problem is we do not have the language skills to understand the messages our emotions are giving us. So what do we do about it? Well, first and foremost, I think it is imperative that we simply accept that emotions, all of them, all the 87, probably more, are simply a guaranteed part of being a human being. You cannot change it. So to wish it were different is entirely pointless. Can you accept that we are emotional creatures? Secondly, can you accept that they don't mean anything about us? They are simply messages. They are simply information. Our subconscious, our deep, knowledgeable wisdom of our body in relation to the life we're living in, the universe that we are in, is understanding things that our thinking mind cannot perceive. So we get a message from our emotions. If you can accept that they are inevitable, all of them are inevitable, if you can accept that actually they're just messages, then we're in a position where we can start learning what they are trying to tell us. And in the understanding of our emotions, well, they take away the threatening nature we have given them. We have given them a definition of they are threatening, they are trying to hurt me, they are paralysing me, they are whatever it might be. Those are simply side effects that we have created because we don't understand the language. So, sit with your emotions. And I fully appreciate it is rarely a convenient time when they bubble up. Rarely. Normally, let's talk work meetings. Yeah, emotion rises, then you go, oh my God, I'm going to cry in a work meeting. Out on the street, in a group of friends, albeit a group of friends should, hate the word, I would hope a group of friends is a place where we can actually show who we are, actually show the fact, oh my God, I've got this big wave of emotion, I don't know what it means. But recognise that it doesn't always happen in a place where we feel comfortable sitting with it, so we suppress it. So we're then in a situation where, well, when are we going to feel these emotions? When we are in a safe place, in a safe space, in a space where we are not going to be embarrassed in front of other people, tap into your emotions. Allow them to come. Don't hold back. And don't judge them. They're simply a message. And to begin with, that message is going to be incomprehensible because you don't have the understanding. But in exactly the same way that people can be immersed in a country that they do not know the language of without any formal lessons, they can pick up the language they are exposed to. So too can we pick up the understanding of our emotions. And when we do, we suddenly open ourselves up to this, actually, this isn't just an inconvenient message. This is genuinely trying to tell me I'm going down the wrong path here. Or this tiny little thing that I wasn't even aware I enjoyed is a source of enormous pleasure for me. When we ignore those messages, we're stuck in this rut, this automated rut that we have been conditioned into and trained into, because the people who were responsible for our upbringings and the people who are responsible for teaching us the skills of being a human being didn't have this knowledge. It is going to be incumbent on you to develop your own emotional intelligence. I leave you with that. I wish you a peaceful and joyful few days, and I will speak to you soon.